Sign it or leave, my son whispered, sliding the papers across the table as if they were nothing more than a restaurant bill. I didn't ask what they were. I didn't ask why. I looked at his hands instead. They were steady, too steady for a man telling his own mother to erase herself. I stood up without a word. I picked up my purse. I walked out of the room. The next morning, I went to the bank. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. The dining room felt different without my husband. The long oak table still bore the faint scratch marks from decades of family dinners, but the warmth was gone. His chair remained pushed in, untouched, exactly where it had been the night before he passed. It had been 10 days since the funeral. 10 days since I stood in the cold wind at the cemetery, listening to dirt hit wood, wondering how silence could be so loud. I was 71 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in my own home. My son sat across from me that evening, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the documents instead of my face. Beside him sat my daughter-in-law, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression polite in the way strangers are polite to one another. There was no raised voice, no anger, just distance, a practiced kind of calm. The papers were already arranged. A pen rested on top, uncapped. Waiting. No one mentioned my husband's name. No one asked how I had slept. No one commented on the black dress I still wore because I hadn't yet found the strength to put it away. The house still smelled faintly of his cologne, the kind he'd worn for over 30 years, cedar and something warm underneath. I noticed it more now that he was gone. This will make things easier. My daughter-in-law said gently, as if explaining a grocery list. She didn't touch the papers. She didn't have to. I didn't read the first page. Not yet. I looked at my son instead. The boy I once held against my chest during thunderstorms. The boy who used to sleep on the floor beside our bed when he had nightmares. He avoided my eyes, staring past me toward the window, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. That was when he leaned forward and whispered it, low, controlled, almost kind. Sign it or leave. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled quietly, heavy as stone. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not shock. Something colder, something clearer. I realized this conversation had been rehearsed long before I ever sat down. I was already behind, already expected to comply. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. Then I stood up. I need some air, I said. No one stopped me. Upstairs, our bedroom was exactly as I'd left it that morning. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand. His slippers were still beneath the bed. I stood there longer than I meant to, breathing in what remained of him, committing the quiet to memory. Downstairs, the papers waited. So did the pen. But I already knew one thing. Whatever they thought I was signing away, they had underestimated how much of myself I still owned. The house changed after my husband died. Not all at once. Quietly, like a room losing heat after the fire goes out. In the mornings, I woke before sunrise, out of habit. I still reached for the other side of the bed, even though I already knew it would be cold. I lay there for a moment each day listening. No breathing, no rustle of newspaper, just the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of traffic starting up on the main road. I made coffee for 2 that first week, poured 1 cup, then the other. I stood at the counter, staring at the extra mug, unsure what to do with it. Eventually, I rinsed it and placed it upside down in the drying rack, like a mistake I didn't want to acknowledge. My son started coming by more often after the funeral. At first, I was grateful. He brought groceries, took out the trash, asked if I needed anything. But he never stayed long. His visits felt scheduled, efficient. He stood more than he sat. Checked his phone between sentences. My daughter-in-law came too, usually with him. She walked through the house with careful steps, her eyes moving from wall to wall as if taking inventory. She commented on practical things, utility bills, maintenance. "This place is a lot to manage alone," she said once, kindly. I nodded, though I had managed it just fine for decades. They stopped asking before moving things. One afternoon, I noticed my husband's toolbox was gone from the garage. Another day, a box of old documents disappeared from the hall closet. When I asked, my son said they were just organizing, making things easier for me. He smiled when he said it, but his eyes slid away before I could respond. The quiet was different now. It wasn't grief anymore. It was exclusion. Meals changed. They stopped inviting me to join them when they ordered takeout. Plates appeared in the trash before I knew food had arrived. Conversations ended when I entered the room. My name came up less. Decisions happened elsewhere. At night, I sat alone in the living room, the television on low, not really watching. My husband's chair remained empty, angled slightly toward the window, like he'd left it. I didn't move it. I didn't need to. It reminded me that once, this house had been shared. I found the first document by accident. It was left on the printer, face down. Legal language. My name. Words like transfer and authorization. I didn't read it all. I didn't have to. I felt it in my chest before I understood it in my head. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, my son suggested we sit down together. His voice was calm, reasonable, as if this were about schedules or holidays. I agreed. I always had. By the time we gathered in the dining room, the papers were already there, neatly stacked, aligned with the edge of the table. The pen placed just right. That was when I understood something clearly. This wasn't about helping me grieve. It wasn't about making things easier. It was about moving me out of the way, and they had decided I wouldn't resist. The changes became harder to ignore after that meeting. Small things at first. Quiet things. The kind you might miss if you weren't paying attention. My son stopped using my name when he spoke to me. It was always hey, or we were thinking. Never mom. Never anything that required looking at me directly. When I spoke, he nodded before I finished, as if the answer had already been decided. My daughter-in-law began rearranging the house, not aggressively, not all at once. A lamp moved from one corner to another, a framed photo quietly removed from the hallway wall. The family pictures stayed. The ones with my husband and me together disappeared. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find my bedroom door closed. That had never happened before. I paused with the bag still in my hands, listening. Voices inside, low, focused. When the door finally opened, my daughter-in-law smiled and said they were just measuring. Measuring for what? She didn't say. My things began to shrink into smaller spaces. One drawer instead of two, one shelf instead of three. My winter coats were moved to the basement, even though the weather hadn't warmed yet. When I asked, my son said it was temporary, just to make room. For what? Again, he didn't explain. Dinner, the conversation shifted. They talked about repairs, property taxes, insurance, numbers I had once managed myself, now discussed as if I weren't there. I listened quietly, my hands folded in my lap, nodding at the right moments. No one noticed when I stopped eating. They spoke about me in the third person. She'll need something smaller, my daughter-in-law said one evening, stirring her soup. It's safer, my son added. Easier, she agreed. I was sitting right there. That night, I stood in the bathroom longer than usual, looking at my reflection. The woman in the mirror looked older than I remembered. Not weak, just tired. 71 years of giving, of adjusting, of making room. I wondered when I had started disappearing without noticing. A few days later, I found a box by the back door. Inside were books I'd kept since my 20s. Notes still tucked between the pages. My handwriting, younger, softer. There was no note, no explanation, just a box, taped shut, ready to be moved. That was when I understood the pattern. They weren't pushing me out all at once. They were erasing me in pieces. I began paying closer attention. The mail they brought inside before I could see it. The phone calls taken in another room. The way my daughter-in-law always positioned herself between my son and me during conversations, subtly, without touching either of us. One evening, I overheard my name from the hallway. Just fragments. Timeline. Signature. Once it's done. I didn't interrupt. I didn't announce myself. I turned around and went back to my room. Later that night, I opened the drawer where I kept old papers, deeds, statements, documents my husband and I had organized together years ago. Some were missing. Not all, just enough. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding what remained, feeling something settle into place inside me. A calm I hadn't felt since before the funeral, since before grief blurred everything. They thought I was lost. Distracted, too tired to notice. They were wrong. And for the first time since my husband died, I stopped waiting for someone to protect me. I started thinking about my husband more after that. Not in the soft, aching way grief usually brings, but in fragments, specific moments, his habits, the way he handled things when something felt wrong. He had always been careful, not fearful, just deliberate. He kept folders labeled in his handwriting, neat and precise. He believed in knowing where things stood, especially when it came to the house, the accounts, the future. Clarity is kindness, he used to say. I hadn't understood how much weight those words carried until he was gone. One afternoon, I pulled a chair into the study and sat there longer than I had since his death. Dust had settled on the desk. I wiped it away with my sleeve and opened the bottom drawer, the one my son never touched. The one that stuck if you didn't pull it just right. Inside were old folders, some outdated, some still relevant. I flipped through them slowly, page by page, letting the quiet guide me. My husband's notes were everywhere. Margins filled with dates, small reminders written in pencil, nothing dramatic, just thorough. That was when I noticed what was still there. Not everything had been taken. I found copies, originals tucked behind other originals, a pattern I recognized. He had done this before surgeries, before long trips, before anything uncertain. He never told anyone, not even me. He just prepared. I sat back and let the realization settle. Downstairs, I could hear my son's voice. He was on the phone, speaking in short sentences, confident ones. He sounded certain, as if the outcome was already secured. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I listened just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. They were in a hurry. That evening, my daughter-in-law knocked on my door. She asked if I was feeling all right. Her tone was polite, concerned, practiced. She mentioned a smaller place again, something easier, something temporary. I told her I was tired, that I'd think about it. She smiled. Relief flickered across her face before she left. In my room, I packed nothing. I sat instead, reviewing what I'd found upstairs, replaying conversations from the past few weeks, the way questions were avoided, the way urgency crept into their voices when deadlines came up. They needed my signature, not my agreement, not my understanding, just the ink. The next day, I drove alone for the first time since the funeral. The steering wheel felt unfamiliar in my hands, but the motion steadied me. I followed streets I'd known for years, passing places my husband and I used to visit together. I didn't stop. I didn't linger. I parked, went inside, and asked for information. Nothing more. When I returned home, the house felt quieter than usual, empty in a way that didn't ache, a useful kind of silence. I placed my purse down carefully. I washed my hands. I moved slowly, deliberately, as I had learned to do. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because things were resolved, but because I finally understood the shape of what was happening. They believed time was on their side. They believed I was overwhelmed. They believed grief had made me careless. They had mistaken stillness for surrender. And as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I made one quiet decision. I would not rush. I would not explain. And I would not sign anything until I was ready. The pressure increased after that. Not loudly, not openly. It showed up in timing. My son began mentioning deadlines, casually, over breakfast, while standing near the door with his keys already in his hand. "We'll need to take care of that soon," he said once, glancing at the calendar on his phone. I asked which day he meant. He shrugged. "Just soon." My daughter-in-law followed with reassurance. She always did. "There's no rush," she said, smiling. "We just don't want things to get complicated." The word complicated hung between us, vague and heavy. I nodded, as if we were talking about weather. More papers appeared on the table over the next few days. Different folders, new tabs, sticky notes marking where a signature would go. They never asked me to read them. They assumed I wouldn't, that I couldn't, that I didn't want to. They were wrong about that too. I read at night after everyone had gone to bed. I sat at the kitchen table with only the small lamp on, the house wrapped in silence. I took my time. I looked up words I didn't know. I compared pages. I noticed what was missing as much as what was written. Ownership changed hands quickly on paper. Responsibility shifted even faster. One evening, my son sat across from me again. He didn't bring the papers this time. He brought his patience, or what he thought passed for it. "We're just trying to help," he said. "You don't need to worry about this stuff anymore." I asked him when I had stopped needing to worry about my own life. He didn't answer. Instead, he sighed. A small sound, controlled, as if I were making things harder than they needed to be. "You're tired," he said. "You've been through a lot." That was when I realized something important. They were building a story, one where I was fragile, confused, overwhelmed. It explained everything, the urgency, the concern, the way decisions were already made before I spoke. It was easier to move me if I agreed with their version of who I was. I didn't correct them. The next morning, I received a call while my son was out. A voice I didn't recognize asked to confirm my address, then my date of birth, then whether I was comfortable discussing financial matters. I said I was. The line went quiet for a second before the voice continued, slower this time. I ended the call politely. When my son returned, I mentioned it casually. His expression changed for just a moment. Not fear, calculation. He asked who had called. I said I wasn't sure. I watched him carefully as he nodded and said nothing more. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law suggested I make a list. Things I wanted to keep. Things I could part with. "It helps," she said, "to feel in control." I thanked her and said I would think about it. Upstairs, I opened my closet and stood there for a long time. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. I already knew what mattered, and it wasn't furniture or dishes or square footage. It was time. I began making my own list that night, not of belongings, of names, of dates, of places I could go without asking permission, people who still spoke to me directly, offices where my name still carried weight. The next day I declined a meeting, just once, calmly, no reason given. The reaction was immediate, concern, follow-up, a reminder of how important this was. I listened, I thanked them, I said I understood, and then I did nothing. That was when they realized something had shifted. They no longer controlled the pace, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet again. The meeting happened sooner than I expected, not because I agreed to it, but because they decided it was time. My son told me we would all sit down together again. He said it like a schedule update, not a request, not a question. He chose the time, late afternoon, when the light through the windows softened everything, making hard conversations feel less sharp. The dining room was already set when I arrived, papers stacked neatly, folders labeled, the same pen as before placed at the edge of my reach. Nothing casual about it. This wasn't a family discussion. It was a presentation. My daughter-in-law stood by the window, arms crossed loosely, watching the street. She turned when I entered and smiled, as if relieved I had come at all. "We just want to be clear," she said, "so there are no misunderstandings." I sat down slowly. I didn't touch the papers. My son began speaking right away. He talked about responsibilities, about stress, about how much there was to manage. He used words like transition and support. He never used the word home. He never said mine or yours. I listened. I always had. At one point, he paused and slid the papers toward me again. Not all at once. Just enough. The sound they made against the table was soft, deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We really need to move forward," he said. "This is the simplest way." I asked him to explain one section, just one. He hesitated. Not long, just enough to notice. Then he summarized it quickly, skipping details, as if speed would prevent questions. My daughter-in-law stepped in to finish the explanation. Her tone was gentle, reassuring. She spoke as though the outcome had already been agreed upon. They were calm, too calm. That was when I realized they weren't worried about convincing me. They were worried about time. I looked at the papers for the first time, not to read them fully, just to confirm what I already knew. My name appeared often. My signature space was clearly marked. My authority ended exactly where theirs began. I folded my hands in my lap. "I'm not signing today," I said. The room shifted, not loudly, subtly. My son leaned back in his chair. My daughter-in-law's smile tightened, just slightly. She recovered quickly. "Of course," she said, "we understand, but we'll need to resolve this soon." There it was again. Soon. My son cleared his throat. "We don't want this to become complicated." I met his eyes then, just for a moment. He looked away first. I stood up, calmly. "I need more time," I said. "That's all." No one argued. No one followed me. They didn't have to. They believed pressure would do the work for them. That evening, the house felt tense, not hostile, expectant, as if something unfinished lingered in the air. I went to my room early and closed the door. For the first time, I locked it. I didn't pack. I didn't cry. I sat on the bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling for the night. Footsteps. A door closing. the television turning off downstairs. I thought about how quickly roles can change, how easily a mother becomes an obstacle, how silence is often mistaken for consent. They believed I was stalling. They believed hesitation meant weakness. They believed the outcome was inevitable. I lay down and turned off the light. In the dark, I allowed myself one small smile, because they were still waiting for my signature, and I was done giving it away. The house grew quieter after that night. Not peaceful, watchful. My son avoided me the next morning. He left early, keys already in hand, a quick goodbye spoken from the doorway without waiting for a response. My daughter-in-law stayed behind, moving through the kitchen with deliberate care, as if noise itself might trigger something. No papers appeared that day. No reminders. No deadlines. That silence told me more than any conversation could. By the third day, the tension shifted. It sharpened. My son asked if we could talk again, just the two of us. He chose the dining room. He always did. Neutral ground, he called it once. I called it familiar territory. The papers were back. He didn't sit right away. He stood at the end of the table, flipping through the stack as if checking order. I watched his face, older than I remembered, tighter. He had learned how to keep emotion contained, but not how to hide impatience. "We need to finish this," he said finally. I said nothing. He slid the chair out and sat down across from me. This time, he didn't bring his rehearsed explanations. No mention of help, no talk of stress or planning. He reached for the pen and placed it directly in front of me. That's when he leaned forward. His voice dropped. Not angry, not raised, controlled, almost private. "Sign it or leave." The words landed exactly where he intended them to. Clean. Final. No room for interpretation. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man he had become, at the distance he thought authority created. I wondered when he had decided this was easier than asking. I picked up the pen. His shoulders relaxed just slightly. Relief, he probably thought. I turned the pen in my fingers, examining the weight of it. Then I placed it back on the table, parallel to the papers, perfectly aligned. "I'm not signing," I said. The room changed. My son exhaled sharply, the first crack in his calm. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said. "I'm making it clear." He stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Then you can't stay here," he said. The words came quickly now, frustration breaking through. "We've tried to be patient." I nodded once. I know. That seemed to confuse him. He had expected resistance, tears, bargaining, something he could push against. He didn't know what to do with agreement. I gathered my purse and stood. Slowly, steadily. "I'll take care of my things," I said. "On my timeline." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't reveal too much. As I walked out of the dining room, I felt something settle inside me. Not sadness. Resolution. Upstairs, I packed only what I needed for the night. A small bag, medication, documents I had already set aside. I didn't touch the rest. I didn't have to. They were in a hurry. I wasn't. At the top of the stairs, I paused and looked back once. The house was quiet, still standing, still mine, in more ways than they understood. That night, I didn't sleep there. I drove away calmly, headlights cutting through the dark, feeling lighter with every mile. Not because I was leaving something behind, but because I had finally stopped being pushed. They thought the ultimatum was the end. They were wrong. It was only the moment they showed their hand. And I was done pretending not to see it. I stayed the first night at a small motel just off the highway. Nothing fancy, clean sheets, a lamp by the bed, a lock I controlled. I paid in advance and didn't give a reason. I didn't need one. In the morning, I woke before my alarm. The room was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my feet touch the floor. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel tight. I breathed slowly and evenly, counting the seconds the way my husband used to when he wanted to calm his thoughts. I didn't call my son. I didn't text my daughter-in-law. I made coffee using the small machine by the window and drank it standing up, watching cars pass on the road below. People heading to work, to school, to places they had chosen. After breakfast, I drove. I went to places I hadn't been to since before the funeral. Offices where my name was still on file. Desks where people remembered my husband and greeted me kindly. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. I took notes. No explanations. No emotions. Just information. Each stop grounded me further. By early afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from my son. Short. Careful. Are you okay? I waited before responding, not out of spite, out of clarity. Yes, I wrote back. Nothing more. The next message came an hour later. We should talk. I didn't reply. That evening, I checked into a different place. Smaller. Quieter. I liked the way the clerk slid the key across the counter without curiosity. I carried my bag myself. I arranged my things exactly how I wanted them. The routine mattered. That night, I reviewed everything I had learned during the day. Dates, names, small details others might overlook. The kind my husband used to underline in pencil. I could almost hear his voice reminding me to take my time. I slept well. The following morning, I received another call. This one from my daughter-in-law. Her tone was gentle, concerned. She asked where I was staying. I told her I was fine. She suggested we meet to clear the air. I said I wasn't ready. She paused before responding, just long enough to notice. Then she agreed quickly, too quickly. Of course, she said. Take your time. The pressure was still there. It had just changed shape. I returned to the house briefly that afternoon when I knew they wouldn't be home. I didn't linger. I collected a few things I had left behind. Important ones. I moved carefully, deliberately. Nothing rushed, nothing emotional. I stood once in the doorway of the dining room. The table was cleared now. No papers, no pen, just empty space where everything had happened. I felt no urge to sit down. As I locked the door behind me, I realized something quietly empowering. They had expected panic. They had expected confusion. They had expected me to fold. Instead, I had stepped aside. By the end of the week, the tone of their messages shifted. Less confident, more frequent. Questions replaced statements. When can we talk? What do you want to do? I read them all. I answered none. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't running. I was choosing distance. From that distance, things became clearer. Their urgency, their assumptions, the way they had underestimated how much I understood and how much I remembered. They believed leaving meant giving up. But as I sat alone that night, papers neatly organized beside me, phone silent at last, I knew the truth. Walking away had given me space. And in that space, I finally had room to act on my own terms. The call came late in the afternoon when the motel parking lot was nearly empty and the sun sat low enough to cast long shadows across the pavement. I recognized the number immediately. I let it ring twice before answering. My son didn't greet me. He went straight to the point. "We need to know what you're planning," he said. I looked out the window while he spoke. A woman loaded groceries into the trunk of her car. She closed it carefully, as if something inside mattered. I wondered if she realized how rare that care was. "I'm taking time," I said. There was a pause on the line, then a shift in his tone. Less certainty, more edge. "Time for what?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. Silence had become useful. It made people fill the space with their own fears. "We're trying to help," he added, "but we can't wait forever." There it was again, the urgency, the deadline they never quite named. "I understand," I said, and ended the call. That evening, I spread the documents out across the small desk in my room. Not theirs, mine. The copies I had kept, the ones my husband had organized long before anyone thought they would be needed. I compared them slowly, page by page, marking differences in pencil. Some signatures were required. Some were optional. Some weren't required at all. The next morning, I made an appointment. I didn't explain why. I didn't mention my son. I simply asked for time on the calendar. When the receptionist confirmed, her voice was polite, neutral, professional. I appreciated that more than sympathy. While I waited, the messages continued. From my daughter-in-law this time, softer words, concern layered carefully over impatience. "We're worried about you," she wrote. "This isn't healthy." I read it once, then again. I didn't respond. That afternoon, I sat in a quiet office across from someone who spoke plainly. No drama, no judgment, just facts. I asked questions. I took notes. I listened. By the time I left, the shape of things had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. I walked back to my car slowly, letting the information settle. The sky had turned gray. Rain threatened but never came. I felt steady, not relieved, prepared. When my phone rang again, I answered. "We've scheduled another meeting," my son said. He sounded tired now. "Tomorrow, we need to resolve this." "I won't be there," I said. The silence that followed was longer this time. "You have to be," he replied. "We need your signature." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, then brought it back. "No," I said calmly. You want my signature. There was a difference, and he heard it. You're making a mistake, he said. No, I answered. I'm correcting one. I ended the call before he could respond. That night, I packed my bag carefully, not to leave town, just to be ready. I placed the documents in order, originals separated from copies, everything labeled, everything deliberate. I thought about the dining room table, the pen, the way the words had been delivered like a final option, sign it or leave. They had believed those were my only choices. But sitting there, alone and unhurried, I understood something clearly. Walking away had never been surrender. It had been step one. And the next move would be mine. The confirmation arrived the next morning by email. Short, formal, the kind that didn't ask questions. I printed the message and folded it once, then again, until it fit neatly into my purse. I didn't feel nervous. I felt organized. That mattered. I returned to the house later that day while my son was at work. I knew his schedule. I had known it for years. My daughter-in-law wasn't home either. The driveway was empty. The quiet welcomed me without resistance. Inside, nothing had changed. The furniture remained where it always had been. The walls still held decades of memory. It felt strange to move through the rooms without asking, realizing I had been asking permission for weeks without noticing. I went straight to the study. The drawer stuck again, just as I remembered. I pulled harder this time. It opened. Inside were the folders I had already reviewed, along with a few I hadn't. Newly placed, too neatly arranged to be old. They hadn't expected me back alone. I sat at the desk and went through everything carefully. Dates, names, amendments, copies that didn't match originals, sections highlighted with confidence, hoping I wouldn't read the rest. They had been selective. I placed the papers in two piles, one for what was valid, one for what was assumed. The second pile grew faster. When I finished, I left everything exactly as I found it. Nothing disturbed, nothing missing. I locked the drawer again. Downstairs, I noticed a new folder on the kitchen counter. My name was written on it in my daughter-in-law's handwriting. Inside were moving brochures, apartments, senior communities, floor plans labeled Easy Living. I closed the folder and slid it back into place. That afternoon, I drove to my appointment. The building was modest, brick, quiet. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. I was greeted by name. That steadied me. The conversation was calm, detailed, grounded in facts, not fear. I listened. I asked for clarification. I took my time. No one rushed me. By the end, I understood exactly where I stood. Not just legally, personally. When I left, the sky had cleared. Sunlight broke through the clouds, sharp and bright. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, letting the feeling settle. That evening, my phone rang again. My son's voice sounded different now, tighter. "We need to talk," he said. "Something's come up." I said I was unavailable. He tried again the next day. Then again, the messages stacked up, shorter each time, less controlled. He asked if I had spoken to anyone. I didn't answer. On the fourth call, he finally said it. "We might have misunderstood some things," he admitted. "There are complications." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them. "I know," I said. He was quiet. I let him be. They had moved quickly, counting on momentum, on grief, on obedience. They hadn't counted on preparation. That night, I laid everything out on the table in my room, documents aligned, notes organized, phone charged, bag ready. I wasn't angry. I was ready. And somewhere between that realization and the quiet hum of the heater turning on, I understood something else. The balance had shifted. They knew it now, too. The meeting happened without ceremony. No dining table. No rehearsed calm. Just a quiet office and 3 chairs arranged in a way that made it clear this was no longer a family discussion. It was a reckoning. My son arrived first. He didn't sit right away. He paced instead, checking his phone, glancing at the door. My daughter-in-law followed a few minutes later. Her smile was gone. In its place was something tighter. Careful. When I walked in, they both looked up at once. I took my seat without greeting them. The conversation didn't start with accusations. It didn't need to. Facts have a way of speaking for themselves. Dates were mentioned, documents referenced. Language they had relied on before was read back slowly, clearly, without interpretation. The air changed. My son leaned forward, hands clasped. "That's not what we meant," he said quickly. "There must be some confusion." There wasn't. I watched their faces as the understanding settled, not all at once. Gradually. like a door closing somewhere they couldn't reach. My daughter-in-law spoke next. Her voice was softer than usual. "We were only trying to protect everyone," she said. "You included." I nodded once. "I know," I said. "You were protecting yourselves." No one argued that. The meeting ended without raised voices, without tears, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been miscalculated, that assumptions had been made, that plans had shifted. Outside, my son caught up with me in the parking lot. "We can still fix this," he said. "There's no need to make it difficult." I turned to face him fully then. I hadn't done that in a long time. "I'm not making it difficult," I said. "I'm making it accurate." He looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time, not as a mother, not as an obstacle, but as someone who would no longer move quietly out of the way. After that day, the messages slowed. The tone changed. Requests replaced demands. Questions replaced instructions. They asked what I wanted to do next, where I planned to stay, how I wanted things handled. I didn't answer right away. I spent the next few days settling into a routine that belonged to me. Morning walks, coffee taken slowly, calls returned when I chose. I didn't rush, I didn't react. I visited the house once more briefly, just to collect the last of my things. My son wasn't there. My daughter-in-law avoided eye contact as I moved through the rooms. She offered help. I declined. Nothing was said. When I left for the final time, I closed the door gently. Not out of sentiment, out of habit. That night, I slept deeply, without interruption, without waiting for the next conversation. They had tried to corner me with urgency. They had tried to shrink me with paperwork. They had tried to move me quietly aside. Instead, they had exposed themselves. And once that happened, there was nothing left to threaten me with. The power they thought they held had never been theirs. It had only existed because I once believed family would protect me. I don't believe that anymore. And that has made all the difference. I moved into the small apartment at the edge of town 2 weeks later. 1 bedroom, 1 window that faced east. Morning light spilled across the floor in a way the old house never allowed. I unpacked slowly, placing things where they felt right, not where they were expected to be. No one helped me move in. I preferred it that way. The silence there was different. It didn't watch me. It didn't wait. It simply existed, steady and unassuming. I brewed coffee each morning and sat by the window, listening to the sounds of other lives beginning their day. Doors opening, cars starting, footsteps passing by without pause. I wasn't lonely. My son called once, a week after everything was settled. His voice was careful again, polite. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. He asked if we could meet sometime. I said maybe. He didn't press. My daughter-in-law sent a message later that month, a long one, apologies woven carefully between explanations. She wrote about misunderstandings, about intentions, about stress. I read it once, then set my phone down. I didn't respond. I wasn't angry. I was finished. Some evenings, I thought about the dining room table, the way the papers had been stacked, the pen placed just within reach, the confidence with which those words had been delivered as if they were a final truth. Sign it or leave. They had believed choice was something they could limit. They were wrong. Leaving hadn't erased me. It had returned me to myself. I kept busy in quiet ways, volunteering a few mornings a week, walking the same path around the neighborhood each afternoon, learning the rhythm of a place that didn't ask anything from me except to exist. One afternoon, I found myself sorting through a box I hadn't opened since the move. Old photographs, letters, notes in my husband's handwriting. I sat on the floor and let myself remember him without urgency, without pressure to move on, just gratitude. He had trusted me more than I had trusted myself. That thought stayed with me. I realized then that the story hadn't ended with paperwork or meetings or ultimatums. It ended with a decision much quieter than all of that. The decision to stop shrinking, to stop explaining, to stop hoping that being accommodating would be enough. Family, I learned, isn't proven by blood or shared walls. It's proven by how someone treats you when you are most vulnerable. I had been vulnerable, and I had been underestimated. Now, when I look back on that moment at the table, I don't feel pain. I feel clarity. It was the moment everything came into focus. The moment I understood that love doesn't whisper ultimatums. If you're listening to this and you've been told to choose between your dignity and your place in someone's life, know this. Walking away is not weakness. Silence is not surrender, and time does not belong only to those who demand it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up quietly, gather what is yours, and leave without asking permission. I did. And in doing so, I didn't lose my family. I found myself.